Miss Marple and the Butterfly Collector's Murder. Tonight's story begins. But before we dive in, welcome, dear listeners. I'm your host, Allie, and it's such a joy to share these mysteries with you. Isn't it wonderful how stories can bring us together in such a cozy way? Tell me in the comments, do you enjoy spending time in nature? Whether it's a quiet garden, a peaceful park, or a walk among the trees, I always love reading your answers. And don't forget to subscribe to Cafe Tales for new mysteries every single day. Now let's begin our journey into tonight's tale. Chapter 1, Fluttering Wings Camper and a Man on the Flagstones. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Benham Grange, casting dancing patterns of light and shadow across the polished mahogany of the entrance hall. It was one of those perfect late June days that England produces with such casual perfection, when the air holds just the right balance of warmth and the promise of evening coolness to come. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her summer hat and smiled pleasantly at the small gathering of visitors who had responded to the Norcotts' invitation for their monthly open afternoon. The Butterfly House, as it had come to be known throughout the district, was something of a local curiosity. Mr. Jasper Norcott's passion for Lepidoptera had transformed what had once been a modest conservatory into a tropical paradise of glass and steel, where exotic butterflies from the far corners of the empire fluttered in carefully controlled splendor. "Such a thoughtful arrangement," murmured Miss Marple to her companion, Mrs. Bantry, who was examining a display case filled with mounted specimens near the drawing-room door. "Dear Dolly, do look at these labels, so very precise and neat." Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a flowered summer dress that seemed to compete cheerfully with the butterfly wings behind glass, peered through her spectacles. "Morpho Pleiades, blue, Morpho Brazil, collected 1949, she read aloud. "My word, Jane, they do travel, don't they? Rather more than we do these days." From across the hall came the crisp voice of their host. Mr. Jasper Norcott was a man of perhaps 60, with the sort of precision in dress and manner that suggested a military background, though Miss Marple knew him to have been in the colonial service. His gray hair was brushed back severely, and his pale blue eyes held the particular intensity of the true collector. "The Morphos are my particular pride," he was saying to Dr. Oswald Kerr, a stout gentleman from Much Benham, who visited regularly and always with an air of barely concealed covetousness. "The blue specimens especially. The iridescence is quite remarkable when properly preserved." Dr. Kerr nodded, his round face flushed with the warmth of the afternoon and perhaps something more. "Remarkable indeed, Norcott. That specimen you acquired last year, quite extraordinary. I don't suppose you'd consider—" "Oh, I think not," Mr. Norcott replied with a thin smile. "The collection stays complete. You know, one can't have gaps." Miss Marple observed this exchange with the mild interest she brought to most human interactions. People, she had long ago discovered, were very much like butterflies themselves. Beautiful, perhaps, but often fragile, and sometimes with a tendency to flutter about in patterns that revealed more about their nature than they might wish. Mrs. Lydia Norcott appeared at that moment, gliding through the drawing-room doors with a sort of effortless elegance that suggested considerable practice. She was perhaps 20 years younger than her husband, with dark hair arranged in the current fashion, and clothes that spoke of London shops rather than country dressmakers. Her smile was warm and practiced as she approached the small group. "Dr. Kerr, how lovely to see you again. And Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, I do hope you'll take tea with us shortly. Cook has made her special seed cake." "How delightful," replied Miss Marple. "Such a pleasure to see the collection again. Mr. Norcott's passion is quite infectious, isn't it?" Mrs. Norcott's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Oh, yes, quite. though I confess I sometimes think Jasper loves his butterflies rather more than—" She paused delicately. "Well, then, is entirely reasonable for a grown man." The group fell into a small silence, broken by the appearance of a young man from the direction of the conservatory. Paul Reeton was perhaps 25, with a sort of eager, slightly anxious manner that Miss Marple associated with those who lived on the edges of other people's lives. His clothes were well cut, but showed signs of careful maintenance, and his hands bore the small scars that came from handling delicate nets and sharp pins. "Mr. Norcott, sir," he called softly. "I think the Papilio may be ready for mounting. Shall I prepare the setting board?" Mr. Norcott's attention shifted immediately. "Ah, Paul, yes, but carefully, mind. The wings are particularly fragile. On that specimen." Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Norcott's expression changed as she watched her husband's absorption in his assistant's words. It was not quite an annoyance, but something more complex, the look of someone who had grown accustomed to being relegated to second place. The group began to move slowly toward the conservatory, or rather the butterfly house, as Mr. Norcott preferred it to be called. Miss Marple found herself walking beside Mrs. Bid, the Norcott's housekeeper, a comfortable, stout woman wearing brown gardening gloves despite the social nature of the afternoon. "Such a responsibility," Mrs. Bid was saying, "keeping those creatures alive in there. The temperature, you know, and the humidity. Like a Turkish bath some days it is." "I imagine it requires considerable attention," Miss Marple agreed. "Rather like tending a hothouse full of orchids." "More complicated than orchids, if you ask me," Mrs. Bid replied, with the frank manner of one who had learned to speak her mind. "Orchids don't try to escape." They had reached the entrance to the butterfly house now, and Miss Marple paused to admire the construction. It was indeed impressive, a soaring structure of glass and painted iron, with carefully positioned vents and what appeared to be a sophisticated heating system. Through the glass walls, she could see the flutter of wings in brilliant blues and yellows, and the green profusion of tropical plants that provided both food and shelter for Mr. Norcott's charges. Dr. Kerr positioned himself near a display case and was studying a particularly large specimen with the sort of intensity that made Miss Marple think of a small boy pressing his nose against a sweet shop window. Miss Felicity Wade, the art mistress from the village school, stood nearby, examining the butterflies with an artist's eye, making small sketches in a notebook she carried. "I use the wing patterns for my jewelry," Miss Wade was explaining to Mrs. Bantry. "Not real wings, of course, but the colors and designs. There's something quite magical about the way the light catches them." Mr. Norcott had moved into the butterfly house itself, and his voice could be heard directing Paul Retton's attention to something near the far wall. The young man nodded earnestly, his net ready in his hands. "The morpho seems to have settled. Near the orchids," Mr. Norcott called back to his guests. "Rather obliging of it, actually. Makes observation much easier." It was then that Miss Marple noticed something that struck her as slightly odd, though she could not have said exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the way Mrs. Norcott's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on her handbag, or the manner in which Paul Retton glanced toward his employer's wife before following Mr. Norcott deeper into the warm, humid atmosphere of the conservatory. The afternoon proceeded pleasantly enough. Tea was served in the drawing room, with cook's seed cake proving every bit as delicious as promised. The conversation moved from butterflies to the weather to the upcoming church fete, the gentle rhythm of English country social interaction. It was perhaps 4 when Mr. Norcott excused himself from the group. "I'm afraid I must just pop into the butterfly house for a moment," he said, setting down his teacup with characteristic precision. One of the morphos seems to have got itself into a bit of a state. Won't take a moment. Through the drawing room windows, the guests could see him walking briskly across the terrace toward the glass structure, his keys glinting in the afternoon sun as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Miss Marple found herself watching as he moved among the plants and display cases, occasionally pausing to examine something more closely. The late afternoon light streaming through the glass cast everything in a golden glow that was really quite beautiful. It was Mrs. Bantry who first remarked that Mr. Norcott seemed to be taking rather a long time. "Perhaps the butterflies are being particularly difficult," she suggested with a laugh. But when another 10 minutes passed with no sign of their host emerging, Mrs. Norcott rose with a small frown of concern. "I do hope nothing's wrong. Jasper can become quite absorbed, you know, but he's usually more mindful of his guests." Paul Retton had moved to the window and was peering toward the butterfly house with obvious anxiety. "I can't see him clearly from here," he said. "The plants are rather thick just now." It was Dr. Kerr who voiced what they were all beginning to think. "Perhaps we should go and see if he requires assistance." The little group moved as one toward the conservatory, their earlier cheerful chatter replaced by a growing sense of unease. Mrs. Bid had produced a large key from her apron pocket. "The master key," she explained, and Paul Retton reached for the door handle. The door opened easily, and immediately they were enveloped in the warm, humid air, thick with the scent of tropical flowers and something else, a sharp, medicinal smell that Miss Marple recognized as camphor used for preserving specimens. "Mr. Norcott," called Paul Retton. There was no answer, and as they moved deeper into the conservatory, stepping carefully along the narrow path between the plant benches, Miss Marple felt that familiar tightening in her chest that came when something was very wrong indeed. They found him near the center of the conservatory, collapsed on the warm flagstones beside a case of mounted specimens. His face was flushed, his breathing shallow and rapid. Dr. Haddock, who had arrived just as they discovered him, knelt beside the fallen man and felt for his pulse. "Heat stroke, I should think," he said grimly. "This temperature, and at his age, we must get him to hospital immediately." But even as the doctor spoke, and arrangements were made to summon an ambulance, Miss Marple found herself looking around the butterfly house with growing puzzlement. The door had opened easily when they tried it, yet Mr. Norcott lay unconscious, as if he had been unable to leave. The vents in the roof appeared to be closed, though surely on such a warm day they should have been open to provide circulation. And there was something else. Something that nagged at the edge of her consciousness as she watched the beautiful butterflies continue their endless, graceful dance through the heated air, quite undisturbed by the human drama playing out below them. Something was not quite right about this picture of a collector overcome by the heat in his own carefully controlled paradise. Something was not right at all. Chapter 2. The roof vent screwed tight. Inspector Slack arrived at Benham Grange with the sort of determined efficiency that had made him both respected and occasionally resented throughout the district. He was a man who believed in facts, evidence, and the straightforward explanation, though his encounters with Miss Marple over the years had taught him a grudging weariness of things that appeared too straightforward. The ambulance had departed 20 minutes earlier, bearing Mr. Norcott to the hospital in Much Benham. Dr. Haddock had pronounced himself cautiously optimistic about the patient's chances, though he had muttered darkly about the folly of elderly gentlemen who failed to respect the dangers of extreme heat. "Clear case of heat stroke, I'd say," Inspector Slack announced to the assembled company, who had gathered in the drawing room while he conducted his preliminary examination of the butterfly house. "Gentleman gets overheated in his conservatory, collapses, door sticks a bit. These old latches can be tricky, and by the time we find him, he's in a bad way. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from her chair by the window, tilted her head slightly. The door didn't seem to stick when young Mr. Retton opened it, Inspector. It opened quite smoothly, as I recall. Inspector Slack's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, yes, Miss Marple, but these things can be temperamental. Heat affects metal, you know. Expansion and contraction. Indeed, murmured Miss Marple, though her tone suggested polite disagreement rather than acceptance. Mrs. Norcott had been pacing the drawing room with barely contained agitation, her earlier poise somewhat frayed by the afternoon's events. I simply don't understand how this could have happened. Jasper's always so careful about the temperature there. He has gauges, thermometers. He watches them like a hawk. Paul Reeton, who had been standing near the fireplace with a stiff posture, of someone trying very hard not to appear nervous, cleared his throat. If I may, Mrs. Norcott, Mr. Norcott did seem particularly concerned about the morpho this afternoon. He mentioned it several times and said it was behaving oddly. What sort of odd? Inquired Inspector Slack, pulling out his notebook with the air of a man determined to leave no detail unrecorded. Well, sir, he thought it might have escaped from its case. He was quite specific about needing to recapture it before it damaged itself on the glass or upset the other specimens. Dr. Kerr, who had been unusually quiet since the discovery, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Morphos can be quite delicate. The blue ones especially. If one did escape, Norcott would certainly want to retrieve it quickly. Miss Marple rose from her chair with a gentle deliberation that those who knew her had learned to recognize as significant. Inspector, if you wouldn't mind, I should very much like to take another look at the conservatory. There seemed to be something. Of course, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack replied, though his tone suggested the tolerance one shows to a persistent, elderly relative. Though I'm not sure what you expect to find that I haven't already noted. The small group made their way back to the butterfly house, where the late afternoon sun was beginning to slant more sharply through the glass walls. The temperature inside remained oppressive, and Miss Marple noticed that several of the guests seemed reluctant to venture far from the entrance. Inspector Slack had positioned himself near the spot where Mr. Norcott had been found and was consulting his notes. As I see it, he began, Mr. Norcott came in here to catch this escaped butterfly, became overheated due to the closed vents and high temperature, and collapsed before he could make his way back to the door. Miss Marple had moved toward the center of the conservatory and was looking upward at the roof structure with considerable interest. The glass panels were set in a framework of painted iron, with several louved vents positioned to provide air circulation. All of the vents, she noted, were firmly closed. Rather warm for such a sealed environment, she observed mildly. I wonder why the vents weren't opened on such a pleasant day. Inspector Slack followed her gaze. Probably forgotten, I'd imagine. Or perhaps they were closed deliberately to maintain the proper humidity for the specimens. But Miss Marple had noticed something else. Moving closer to one of the supporting benches, she peered upward at the nearest vent mechanism. Inspector, would you be so kind as to look at these brass screws here? They seem rather bright. Inspector Slack produced a small torch from his pocket and directed its beam toward the vent fixture. The brass screws that held the louvre mechanism did indeed appear unusually bright, as if they had been recently disturbed. More tellingly, there were tiny brass filings scattered on the wooden staging below, glinting like gold dust in the torch beam. Fresh work, he admitted grudgingly. Someone's been tightening these screws quite recently. Mrs. Bid, who had been hovering near the doorway, stepped forward. That would be odd, Inspector. Mr. Norcott always kept those vents in perfect working order. Never needed tightening. They didn't. Paul Retton nodded in agreement. Mr. Norcott was very particular about the ventilation system. He checked it weekly, sometimes daily, during the warmer months. I can't imagine why he would have tightened the screws to prevent the vents from opening. Perhaps he didn't, said Miss Marple quietly, though her words carried clearly in the humid air. Perhaps someone else did. The implications of this observation settled over the group like a cloud. Inspector Slack's expression had shifted from mild irritation to the sort of focused attention that Miss Marple had learned to appreciate. You're suggesting deliberate interference with the ventilation system. I'm suggesting nothing, Inspector, merely observing that fresh brass filings don't appear by themselves, and that one doesn't typically tighten vents on a warm afternoon, when air circulation would be most welcome. Mrs. Norcott had grown noticeably paler. But who would do such a thing, and why? It was Dr. Kerr who voiced what they were all beginning to think. If someone deliberately sealed the vents and then lured Norcott in here. Murder, said Inspector Slack flatly, though I'm bound to say it seems a rather elaborate method. Miss Marple had moved to examine the potting bench near one of the side walls. The tools were neatly arranged, as one might expect in such a precisely maintained environment, but there was a gap in the orderly lineup. Mrs. Bid, she called gently, was a screwdriver usually kept here among the garden tools? The housekeeper approached and examined the bench. Why, yes, Miss Marple. Small one with a wooden handle. Mr. Norcott used it for adjusting the display. Cases and such. I don't see it there now. Inspector Slack had begun a more thorough search of the conservatory, and it was Paul Retton who discovered the missing tool. Inspector, over here in the lily trough. The screwdriver lay half submerged among the water lilies in an ornamental pool near the eastern wall of the conservatory. Its brass fittings matched those of the vent screws, and the blade showed traces of fresh brass filings. Disposed of rather hastily, observed Miss Marple, watching as Inspector Slack carefully retrieved the tool with his handkerchief. Almost as if whoever used it wanted to be rid of it quickly but didn't have time to carry it far. Mrs. Norcott sank onto one of the wooden benches, her composure finally cracking. This is horrible, perfectly horrible. Who would want to harm Jasper? He never hurt anyone. His only passion was his butterflies. But Miss Marple was thinking of other passions. The way Dr. Kerr's eyes lingered on the rare specimens, the tension she had observed between husband and wife, the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from young Paul Retton. Passions in her experience were rarely limited to butterflies, however beautiful. Inspector Slack was taking careful notes, measuring distances, and generally conducting himself with the thoroughness that had earned him his position. But Miss Marple found her attention drawn to smaller details, the way the afternoon light fell across the brass filings, the precise arrangement of the tools on the potting bench, the careful labels on each specimen case. Inspector, she said finally, I wonder if we might examine the rest of the house. If someone did indeed tamper with the ventilation system, they might have left other traces of their presence. Inspector Slack nodded, though he glanced once more at the sealed vents and the scattered brass filings. Quite right, Miss Marple. Though I'm bound to say this is turning into rather more than a simple case of heat stroke. As they prepared to leave the conservatory, Miss Marple paused to look back at the beautiful creatures still fluttering among the tropical plants, seemingly oblivious to the human drama that had unfolded in their carefully controlled paradise. There was something almost tragic about their continued dance, she thought, trapped as they were in their glass prison, however luxurious it might be. Rather like people in many ways, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately trapped by circumstances of their own making, or by the machinations of others, who saw them as no more than specimens to be collected, controlled, or disposed of as convenience demanded. The thought was not a comfortable one, and Miss Marple found herself looking forward to the cooler air of the house proper, away from the oppressive heat and the lingering questions that seemed to multiply with each small discovery. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices blue on a brown glove. The drawing room at Benham Grange had taken on the subdued atmosphere that settles over a household when routine has been thoroughly disrupted by unexpected events. Mrs. Norcott sat rigidly, upright in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white beneath the skin. Dr. Kerr had positioned himself near the bookshelf, ostensibly examining the volumes, but clearly listening to every word of Inspector Slack's methodical questioning. Paul Retton stood by the French windows, occasionally glancing toward the hospital telephone that sat silent on the side table. No word had yet come from Much Benham regarding Mr. Norcott's condition, and the young man's anxiety was becoming increasingly apparent. "Now then," Inspector Slack was saying, consulting his notebook with the air of a man determined to establish facts in their proper order. "I need to understand the movements of everyone this afternoon. Mrs. Norcott, when did you last see your husband before he went into the conservatory?" "During tea," Lydia Norcott replied, her voice carefully controlled. "We were all together here." Jasper seemed perfectly normal, though he did mention the morpho butterfly several times. He seemed concerned about its behavior. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from her seat near the window, looked up from her knitting. "Mrs. Bid, my dear, you were wearing gloves this afternoon, weren't you? Brown gardening gloves, if I recall correctly." The housekeeper, who had been tidying the tea things with mechanical precision, paused in her work. "Yes, Miss Marple. I always wear them when there are visitors. Keep the hands looking respectable, you know." "Of course, so sensible." Miss Marple's tone was gently conversational. "I wonder, might I see them for a moment? There seemed to be something." Mrs. Bid looked puzzled, but obligingly produced the gloves from her apron pocket. They were well worn, brown leather, the sort favored by practical country folk for outdoor work. Miss Marple examined them with a careful attention she might have given to a particularly intricate piece of embroidery. "How curious," she murmured, holding one glove closer to the light. "Inspector, would you mind very much taking a look at this?" Inspector Slack approached with the expression of a man who had learned not to dismiss Miss Marple's observations, however insignificant they might initially appear. Miss Marple indicated a small area on the palm of the right glove, where tiny specks of brilliant blue caught the afternoon light. "Butterfly scales," she said quietly. "Rather beautiful ones, actually. The sort of iridescent blue that one associates with tropical species." Mrs. Bid's face flushed. "I'm sure I don't know how they got there, Miss Marple. I never touch the butterfly cases. That's strictly Mr. Norcott's province or young Paul's under supervision." "But you do clean the house naturally," Miss Marple continued in her mild way, "including Mr. Norcott's study." "Well, yes, of course, though I'm always very careful about his specimens and such. He's particular about not disturbing things." Dr. Kerr had moved closer, his professional interest clearly aroused. "May I?" He examined the glove carefully, then looked up with a frown. "These are definitely morpho scales. The blue is quite distinctive, but Mrs. Bid is quite right. The tropical butterflies are kept exclusively in the conservatory, not in the study." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what makes it so interesting, don't you think?" "Mrs. Bid, you mentioned that you never touch the tropical cases, but surely you must dust Mr. Norcott's study regularly." "Every other day without fail. Mr. Norcott insists upon it, though I'm always careful not to disturb his work, and his work would include the specimen cases in the study. Oh, yes, he has several cabinets there, British butterflies mostly, and some of his mounting equipment, but those cases are always kept locked. Inspector Slack had been following this exchange with growing interest. Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that these scales came from the study rather than the conservatory? I'm suggesting that it's worth investigating where they might have originated. You see, in my experience, household dust is quite different from butterfly scales. One learns to distinguish between them when one has spent as many years dusting parlors as I have. Paul Reeton had turned from the window, his face pale. Mr. Norcott did keep some morpho specimens in his study cabinet. Not live ones, of course, but mounted examples. He used them for reference when working on new acquisitions. Mrs. Norcott's composure slipped slightly. Jasper was always bringing his work into the house. I used to complain about the pins and the setting boards cluttering up his desk, but he said he needed proper light for the delicate work. Miss Marple had resumed her knitting, but her needles moved more slowly than usual. Mrs. Bid, when you cleaned the study this morning, did you notice anything unusual? Any disturbance among Mr. Norcott's specimens? The housekeeper considered this carefully. Well, now that you mention it, there was something. One of the cabinet drawers was standing open a bit, and there were some bits of wing and such on the desk. I thought perhaps Mr. Norcott had been working late last night. Did you clean up these bits of wing? Oh, yes, naturally. Can't leave such things lying about. I used the small brush from Mr. Norcott's cleaning kit. He's very particular about using the proper tools for his specimens. And you were wearing your gloves at the time. Always do when cleaning. These old hands aren't fit to be seen otherwise. Inspector Slack made a note in his book. So the scales on Mrs. Bid's gloves came from cleaning up fragments in the study, not from any contact with the live butterflies in the conservatory. It would seem so, agreed Miss Marple, which raises the interesting question of how morpho fragments came to be scattered on Mr. Norcott's desk this morning. Dr. Kerr cleared his throat. Morpho wings are quite fragile, particularly the older specimens. If someone was handling them carelessly or deliberately, added Miss Marple softly, the implications of this hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Norcott had grown very still, her earlier agitation replaced by a watchfulness that reminded Miss Marple of a cat preparing for spring. I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting, Mrs. Norcott said finally. If someone was in Jasper's study last night interfering with his specimens, it would suggest a degree of familiarity with both the house and Mr. Norcott's collecting habits. Someone who knew where to find the specimens, and perhaps more importantly, someone who had access to the study after hours, Miss Marple observed. Paul Reeton, I do sometimes work in the study during the evenings where Mr. Norcott wants specimens prepared for mounting, but I would never damage anything deliberately. Of course not, dear boy. But someone clearly was handling the morpho specimens recently. The question is why? Inspector Slack had moved to the window and was gazing out toward the conservatory where the late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows. Miss Marple, are you suggesting that this interference with the specimens is connected to what happened to Mr. Norcott today? I'm suggesting that it's an odd coincidence, Inspector. Mr. Norcott rushes into the conservatory to recapture an escaped morpho. Yet morpho fragments are found scattered on his study desk the same morning. One wonders if the escape was quite as spontaneous as it appeared. Mrs. Bid had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. You mean someone might have damaged a specimen on purpose to make it look like one had escaped? It's a possibility, worth considering. After all, what would compel a careful collector like Mr. Norcott to enter an overheated conservatory, except the prospect of preventing damage to a valuable specimen. The room fell silent as this suggestion sank in. Outside, the shadows were lengthening, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the half-hour. The peaceful English afternoon had acquired an undertone of menace that seemed to emanate from the very walls of Benham Grange. Dr. Kerr spoke first, his voice unusually subdued. A deliberate lure, someone who knew Norcott's character well enough to predict his response to such a crisis. Someone, added Miss Marple gently, who had access to the study, knowledge of the specimens, an opportunity to tamper with the conservatory ventilation system. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Right then. I think it's time we had a thorough look at this study of Mr. Norcott's, and I want to know exactly who had access to the house last night. As they prepared to move to the study, Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting. The blue scales on Mrs. Bidd's glove had told a small story, but she suspected it was only the beginning of a much larger and more complex tale, a tale that would require careful unraveling, thread by thread, until the complete pattern emerged. Chapter 4. The Glassine Triangle That Weighed Nothing. Mr. Norcott's study was a testament to the methodical mind of a serious collector. Every surface bore evidence of his passion for Lepidoptera, from the rows of specimen cabinets with their gleaming brass fittings to the carefully arranged tools of the trade that lay in precise order across the broad mahogany desk. The late afternoon light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like miniature spirits. Inspector Slack surveyed the room with the systematic gaze of a man accustomed to searching for evidence in unlikely places. Very orderly, I'll give him that. Makes our job easier when things are kept just so. Miss Marple moved quietly around the room, her eyes taking in details that spoke of a lifetime's dedication to scientific pursuit. The walls were lined with framed specimens, each mounted with museum-quality precision, and accompanied by tiny labels written in Mr. Norcott's careful copperplate hand. "Such beautiful work," she murmured, pausing before a display of British blues. "And such patience it must require, each specimen treated as a work of art." Mrs. Norcott had followed them into the study, though she remained near the doorway as if reluctant to venture deeper into her husband's private domain. Jasper always said that careless mounting was worse than no mounting at all. He could spend hours getting a single wing positioned exactly right. Paul Retton nodded earnestly. Mr. Norcott was very particular about technique. He taught me that every specimen deserves the same care, whether it's a common white or the rarest tropical blue. Dr. Kerr had positioned himself near one of the specimen cabinets and was examining the contents with obvious appreciation. Remarkable collection. That Adonis blue must be 40 years old, yet the color is still perfect. Miss Marple had moved to the desk where the morning's cleaning had removed the wing fragments that Mrs. Bidd had mentioned. The surface was now spotless, save for the usual tools of the lepidopterist trade, and a few papers held down by a small glass paperweight shaped like a butterfly. It was then that she noticed the glassine triangle. It lay on a shelf near the window among other specimen containers and supplies. At first glance it appeared unremarkable, a small triangular envelope of the type commonly used to store butterfly. Specimens made from the translucent material that allowed examination without exposure to air and handling. This particular triangle bore a label in Mr. Norcott's careful script. Morpho Lev. "Inspector," Miss Marple called gently, "might you examine this small envelope here?" Inspector Slack approached and picked up the triangle, holding it to the light. Labeled as containing a live morpho. That would be one of the blue tropical ones, I assume. "Indeed it would," confirmed Dr. Kerr, moving closer. "Though I must say it seems rather small for housing a live specimen. Morphos are quite large butterflies." Miss Marple had been watching Inspector Slack's handling of the envelope with considerable interest. "Inspector, forgive me, but does that triangle seem to weigh what you might expect?" Inspector Slack frowned and held the envelope more carefully, testing its weight. "Now that you mention it, Miss Marple, it seems remarkably light, almost as if—" He held it up to the window where the afternoon light revealed its contents clearly. "Good Lord, there's nothing in here but a small curl of what appears to be gummed paper." The significance of this discovery was not lost on the assembled company. Paul Retton's face had gone quite pale, while Mrs. Norcott gripped the doorframe as if for support. "An empty envelope," Dr. Kerr said slowly. "Labeled as containing a live butterfly." "Rather than empty," observed Miss Marple, watching as Inspector Slack carefully opened the triangle and extracted the curl of paper. "Someone took considerable trouble to make it appear authentic. The label is quite convincing, written in Mr. Norcott's own hand." Inspector Slack unfolded the paper, revealing it to be a small strip of the gummed material used for mounting labels. "Weighted just enough to make the envelope feel as though it contained something, but not enough to suggest an actual butterfly." Mrs. Norcott found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "I don't understand. Why would someone create a false specimen envelope?" Miss Marple had moved to examine the other containers on the shelf, noting their arrangement and condition. "Mrs. Bid mentioned finding wing fragments on the desk this morning. One might wonder if those fragments came from a specimen that was deliberately damaged to create this little deception." "You mean someone broke a mounted morpho and then created this fake container to suggest a live escape?" Paul Retton's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "It would explain the fragments in the study," Inspector Slack agreed grimly, "and it would certainly provide motivation for Mr. Norcott to rush into the conservatory, particularly if he believed a valuable live specimen was at risk." Dr. Kerr had been examining the label more closely. "The handwriting does appear to be Norcott's, though I suppose it could be forged by someone familiar with his script." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Or perhaps the label was taken from a legitimate specimen and transferred to this decoy envelope. It would be simpler than attempting forgery and far more convincing." The room fell silent as the implications of this discovery settled over them. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create a convincing reason for Mr. Norcott to enter the sealed conservatory. The elaborate nature of the deception suggested both familiarity with his habits and access to his specimens. "Bait," Miss Marple said softly, voicing what they were all thinking. This little envelope was nothing more than bait, designed to lure a dedicated collector into a trap. Mrs. Norcott sank into a chair near the desk, her composure finally cracking completely. But who would do such a thing, and why? Jasper never harmed anyone. His whole life was devoted to preserving beautiful things. Inspector Slack had begun a more thorough search of the desk drawers, looking for additional evidence of tampering. Someone who knew his habits very well, someone who understood that he would never ignore what appeared to be an escaped live specimen. "Paul Retton, I do sometimes work in the study during the evenings where Mr. Norcott wants specimens prepared for mounting, but I would never damage anything deliberately." "Of course not, dear boy, but someone clearly was handling the morpho specimens recently. The question is why?" Inspector Slack had moved to the window and was gazing out toward the conservatory where the late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that this interference with the specimens is connected to what happened to Mr. Norcott today?" "I'm suggesting that it's an odd coincidence, Inspector. Mr. Norcott rushes into the conservatory to recapture an escaped morpho. Yet morpho fragments are found scattered on his study desk the same morning. One wonders if the escape was quite as spontaneous as it appeared. Mrs. Bid had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. You mean someone might have damaged a specimen on purpose to make it look like one had escaped? It's a possibility, worth considering. After all, what would compel a careful collector like Mr. Norcott to enter an overheated conservatory, except the prospect of preventing damage to a valuable specimen? The room fell silent as this suggestion sank in. Outside, the shadows were lengthening, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the half-hour. The peaceful English afternoon had acquired an undertone of menace that seemed to emanate from the very walls of Benham Grange. Dr. Kerr spoke first, his voice unusually subdued. A deliberate lure, someone who knew Norcott's character well enough to predict his response to such a crisis. Someone, added Miss Marple gently, who had access to the study, knowledge of the specimens, an opportunity to tamper with the conservatory ventilation system. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Right then, I think it's time we had a thorough look at this study of Mr. Norcott's, and I want to know exactly who had access to the house last night. As they prepared to move to the study, Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting. The blue scales on Mrs. Bid's glove had told a small story, but she suspected it was only the beginning of a much larger and more complex tale, a tale that would require careful unraveling, thread by thread, until the complete pattern emerged. Chapter 4, The Glassine Triangle That Weighed Nothing. Mr. Norcott's study was a testament to the methodical mind of a serious collector. Every surface bore evidence of his passion for Lepidoptera, from the rows of specimen cabinets with their gleaming brass fittings to the carefully arranged tools of the trade that lay in precise order across the broad mahogany desk. The late afternoon light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like miniature spirits. Inspector Slack surveyed the room with the systematic gaze of a man accustomed to searching for evidence in unlikely places. Very orderly, I'll give him that. Makes our job easier when things are kept just so. Miss Marple moved quietly around the room, her eyes taking in details that spoke of a lifetime's dedication to scientific pursuit. The walls were lined with framed specimens, each mounted with museum-quality precision and accompanied by tiny labels written in Mr. Norcott's careful copperplate hand. "Such beautiful work," she murmured, pausing before a display of British blues. "And such patience it must require, each specimen treated as a work of art." Mrs. Norcott had followed them into the study, though she remained near the doorway as if reluctant to venture deeper into her husband's private domain. Jasper always said that careless mounting was worse than no mounting at all. He could spend hours getting a single wing positioned exactly right. Paul Retton nodded earnestly. Mr. Norcott was very particular about technique. He taught me that every specimen deserves the same care, whether it's a common white or the rarest tropical blue. Dr. Kerr had positioned himself near one of the specimen cabinets and was examining the contents with obvious appreciation. "Remarkable collection. That Adonis blue there must be 40 years old, yet the color is still perfect." Miss Marple had moved to the desk where the morning's cleaning had removed the wing fragments that Mrs. Bid had mentioned. The surface was now spotless, save for the usual tools of the lepidopterist trade and a few papers held down by a small glass paperweight shaped like a butterfly. It was then that she noticed the glassine triangle. It lay on a shelf near the window among other specimen containers and supplies. At first glance it appeared unremarkable, a small triangular envelope of the type commonly used to store butterfly. Specimens made from the translucent material that allowed examination without exposure to air and handling. This particular triangle bore a label in Mr. Norcott's careful script. Morpho Live. "Inspector," Miss Marple called gently. Might you examine this small envelope here? Inspector Slack approached and picked up the triangle, holding it to the light. Labeled as containing a live morpho, that would be one of the blue tropical ones, I assume. Indeed it would, confirmed Dr. Kerr, moving closer, though I must say it seems rather small for housing a live specimen. Morphos are quite large butterflies. Miss Marple had been watching Inspector Slack's handling of the envelope with considerable interest. Inspector, forgive me, but does that triangle seem to weigh what you might expect? Inspector Slack frowned and held the envelope more carefully, testing its weight. Now that you mention it, Miss Marple, it seems remarkably light, almost as if... He held it up to the window, where the afternoon light revealed its contents clearly. Good Lord. There's nothing in here but a small curl of what appears to be gummed paper. The significance of this discovery was not lost on the assembled company. Paul Reeton's face had gone quite pale, while Mrs. Norcott gripped the door frame as if for support. An empty envelope, Dr. Kerr said slowly, labeled as containing a live butterfly. Rather than empty, observed Miss Marple, watching as Inspector Slack carefully opened the triangle and extracted the curl of paper. Someone took considerable trouble to make it appear authentic. The label is quite convincing, written in Mr. Norcott's own hand. Inspector Slack unfolded the paper, revealing it to be a small strip of the gummed material used for mounting labels. Weighted just enough to make the envelope feel as though it contained something, but not enough to suggest an actual butterfly. Mrs. Norcott found her voice, though it trembled slightly. I don't understand. Why would someone create a false specimen envelope? Miss Marple had moved to examine the other containers on the shelf, noting their arrangement and condition. Mrs. Bid mentioned finding wing fragments on the desk this morning. One might wonder if those fragments came from a specimen that was deliberately damaged to create this little deception. You mean someone broke a mounted morpho and then created this fake container to suggest a live escape? Paul Reeton's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. It would explain the fragments in the study, Inspector Slack agreed grimly. And it would certainly provide motivation for Mr. Norcott to rush into the conservatory, particularly if he believed a valuable live specimen was at risk. Dr. Kerr had been examining the label more closely. The handwriting does appear to be Norcott's, though I suppose it could be forged by someone familiar with his script. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Or perhaps the label was taken from a legitimate specimen and transferred to this decoy envelope. It would be simpler than attempting forgery and far more convincing. The room fell silent as the implications of this discovery settled over them. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create a convincing reason for Mr. Norcott to enter the sealed conservatory. The elaborate nature of the deception suggested both familiarity with his habits and access to his specimens. Bait, Miss Marple said softly, voicing what they were all thinking. This little envelope was nothing more than bait, designed to lure a dedicated collector into a trap. Mrs. Norcott sank into a chair near the desk, her composure finally cracking. Completely. But who would do such a thing, and why? Jasper never harmed anyone. His whole life was devoted to preserving beautiful things. Inspector Slack had begun a more thorough search of the desk drawers, looking for additional evidence of tampering. Someone who knew his habits very well. Someone who understood that he would never ignore what appeared to be an escaped live specimen. Paul Reeton, I do sometimes work in the study during the evenings where Mr. Norcott wants specimens prepared for mounting, but I would never damage anything deliberately. Of course not, dear boy, but someone clearly was handling the morpho specimens recently. The question is why. Inspector Slack had moved to the window and was gazing out toward the conservatory where the late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that this interference with the specimens is connected to what happened to Mr. Norcott today?" "I'm suggesting that it's an odd coincidence. Inspector, Mr. Norcott rushes into the conservatory to recapture an escaped morpho, yet morpho fragments are found scattered on his study desk the same morning. One wonders if the escape was quite as spontaneous as it appeared." Mrs. Bid had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. "You mean someone might have damaged a specimen on purpose to make it look like one had escaped?" "It's a possibility worth considering. After all, what would compel a careful collector like Mr. Norcott to enter an overheated conservatory, except the prospect of preventing damage to a valuable specimen?" The room fell silent as this suggestion sank in. Outside, the shadows were lengthening, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the half-hour. The peaceful English afternoon had acquired an undertone of menace that seemed to emanate from the very walls of Benham Grange. Dr. Kerr spoke first, his voice unusually subdued. A deliberate lure, someone who knew Norcott's character well enough to predict his response to such a crisis. "Someone," added Miss Marple gently, "who had access to the study, knowledge of the specimens, an opportunity to tamper with the conservatory ventilation system." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Right then, I think it's time we had a thorough look at this study of Mr. Norcott's, and I want to know exactly who had access to the house last night." As they prepared to move to the Yaxpo study, Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting. The blue scales on Mrs. Bid's glove had told a small story, but she suspected it was only the beginning of a much larger and more complex tale, a tale that would require careful unraveling, thread by thread, until the complete pattern emerged. Chapter 5. The thermostat bulb rapped for cold. The evening shadows were beginning to lengthen across the grounds of Benham Grange when Inspector Slack suggested they return to the conservatory for a more detailed examination of the heating apparatus. The discovery of the empty glassine triangle had transformed what might have been considered an unfortunate accident into something far more sinister, and every detail now required the most careful scrutiny. Miss Marple followed the group back into the glass structure, though the oppressive heat had not diminished with the advancing hour. If anything, the enclosed space seemed to have absorbed the day's warmth and was reluctant to release it, creating an atmosphere that was almost suffocating in its intensity. "The heating system appears quite sophisticated," observed Inspector Slack, examining the small paraffin heater that sat among the tropical plants. "Rather more elaborate than one might expect for a simple conservatory." Dr. Kerr nodded approvingly. Norcott spared no expense when it came to maintaining proper conditions for his specimens. Temperature control is absolutely critical for tropical species. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the heater and was studying its various components with the methodical attention she brought to any mechanical puzzle. The device was indeed complex, with gauges, pipes, and what appeared to be an automatic regulation system designed to maintain precise temperatures. "How curious," she murmured, bending closer to examine a small bulbous component connected to the main apparatus by a length of thin tubing. "This little bulb here, would this be the temperature sensor, do you suppose?" Paul Retton moved closer, his expertise evident as he explained the mechanism. "Yes, Miss Marple, that's the thermostat bulb. It contains a fluid that expands and contracts, with temperature changes, which opens and closes the valve to control the fuel flow." Mr. Norcott was very proud of the system, said it was more reliable than the electric controls they use in some of the London botanical gardens. Inspector Slack had produced his torch again and was examining the sensor bulb with considerable interest. There seems to be something wrapped around this bulb, some sort of fabric. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. Indeed, there does. And notice how damp it appears despite the dry heat in here. The fabric proved to be a small piece of muslin wrapped carefully around the temperature sensor and secured with what appeared to be ordinary string. The muslin was indeed damp, and there were droplets of condensation visible on the metal bracket that held the sensor in place. Most peculiar, Dr. Kerr observed. Why would anyone wrap the temperature sensor? It would completely interfere with its ability to read the ambient temperature accurately. Paul Retton's face had grown thoughtful. If the sensor thought the temperature was much lower than it actually was, the heater would continue running at full capacity, regardless of the actual heat in the conservatory. Precisely, agreed Miss Marple, and if one wanted to ensure that a conservatory became dangerously overheated. Inspector Slack carefully removed the damp muslin, noting how it had been arranged to completely surround the sensor bulb. This wasn't placed here accidentally. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Mrs. Norcott had remained near the entrance throughout this examination, but now she spoke with obvious distress. But who would know about such technical details? Jasper rarely discussed the heating system with anyone except Paul. Miss Marple had been examining the discarded muslin with considerable attention. Inspector, this fabric has a very particular smell to it. Rather like, she paused, considering, rather like ice that has recently melted. Ice? Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose. In this heat? Ice wrapped in muslin would indeed create exactly this sort of condensation pattern, Miss Marple explained, patiently. And it would certainly convince any temperature sensor that the surrounding air was much cooler than it actually was. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Someone had deliberately fooled the heating system into overheating the conservatory by wrapping the sensor in ice-cooled muslin. Combined with the sealed ventilation system, it would have created a death trap of remarkable efficiency. Dr. Kerr whistled softly. Diabolically clever. The heater would have been running at maximum output, thinking it needed to warm a cool space, while the actual temperature soared far beyond safe levels. Paul Retton nodded grimly. Mr. Norcott would never have suspected. He trusted his equipment implicitly. If the gauges read normal, he would have assumed the temperature was properly controlled. Inspector Slack had begun taking detailed notes, sketching the arrangement of the heating system and the position where the muslin had been found. This required considerable planning. Someone had to obtain ice, prepare the muslin wrapping, and install it without being observed. Miss Marple had wandered toward the house side of the conservatory and was peering through the glass toward the kitchen wing. Mrs. Bid, my dear, might we have a word with Cook? I'm suddenly very curious about the household's ice consumption today. The group made their way back into the house where they found Cook in her domain, clearing away the remnants of the afternoon's tea service. She was a comfortable, middle-aged woman with the slightly flustered air of someone whose routine had been thoroughly disrupted by the day's dramatic events. Ice, Miss Marple, Cook repeated when the question was put to her. Why, yes, we did use rather more ice than usual today. Mrs. Norcott requested a good quantity this morning, said she wanted to prepare special lemonade for the visitors, though I must say I never did see any lemonade served. Mrs. Norcott's face had grown very pale. I did think about making lemonade, but then I decided the usual tea service would be more appropriate for the afternoon. Miss Marple's voice remained gently conversational. And the ice, dear. What became of it? I'm sure I don't recall. Exactly. Perhaps it melted, or... Mrs. Norcott's voice trailed off uncertainly. Cook, however, had no such uncertainty. "Begging your pardon, Mum, but I did notice you'd taken one of my good muslin bags from the scullery. The one I use for straining broths and such. Haven't seen it since this morning." "I haven't." Inspector Slack's attention had sharpened considerably. "Mrs. Norcott, are you telling us that you requested ice and took a muslin bag this morning, but used neither for their stated purpose?" The silence that followed this question seemed to stretch endlessly. Outside, the last light of the June evening was fading, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour with solemn precision. Mrs. Norcott's composure finally cracked completely. I may have forgotten exactly what I intended." But Miss Marple was looking at her with a sort of gentle, implacable gaze that had unraveled many a carefully constructed deception over the years. "My dear Mrs. Norcott, ice doesn't simply vanish, and muslin bags don't disappear by themselves. Someone used them to create a very specific effect on your husband's heating system. The truth hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and unmistakable. The ice, the muslin, the wrapped sensor bulb, it all pointed to a deliberate and carefully planned attempt to transform the conservatory into a lethal trap. And Mrs. Norcott's own words had placed the materials firmly in her possession at exactly the time they would have been needed. Chapter 6. The Case Drawer That Locked Itself. The tension in Cook's kitchen had become almost unbearable when the telephone in the hall began to ring with sharp, insistent peals that cut through the heavy silence like a knife. Mrs. Norcott started at the sound, her face draining of what little color remained, while Inspector Slack moved swiftly to answer the call. His conversation was brief and conducted in the sort of measured tones that suggested official business. When he returned to the kitchen, his expression was grave, but not without hope. "That was the hospital," he announced. "Mr. Norcott has regained consciousness. The doctors are cautiously optimistic, though he remains in a serious condition. He's been asking for his wife." Mrs. Norcott rose unsteadily from her chair, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. "I must go to him immediately. Whatever else has happened, he needs me now." "I'm afraid that won't be possible just yet, Mrs. Norcott," Inspector Slack replied firmly. "Given the nature of our investigation, I must ask you to remain here for the time being. There are still questions that require answers." Miss Marple had been observing this exchange with the quiet attention she brought to all human drama, noting the complex emotions that played across Mrs. Norcott's features. Relief at her husband's survival, warring with something that might have been fear or guilt. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "perhaps we might continue our examination of Mr. Norcott's study. I have the feeling that we haven't discovered everything of significance there." Inspector Slack nodded agreement, though his eyes remained fixed on Mrs. Norcott with the sort of professional suspicion that comes from years of investigating human nature at its worst. "An excellent suggestion, Miss Marple. Mrs. Norcott, I must ask you to accompany us." The study felt different in the evening light, shadows gathering in the corners and lending an air of mystery to the carefully arranged specimens and scientific instruments. Miss Marple moved directly to the specimen cabinets, examining each with renewed interest now that she understood the deliberate nature of the afternoon's events. "These cabinets," she observed, "they're all kept locked, are they?" "Not?" Paul Retton confirmed this with a nod. Mr. Norcott was very particular about security. Some of the specimens are quite valuable, and all of them are irreplaceable if damaged. Miss Marple had paused before one particular cabinet, a mahogany piece with brass fittings that matched the others, but seemed somehow different. "This drawer appears to be locked as well, yet something about it strikes me as unusual." Dr. Kerr approached to examine the cabinet more closely. Now that you mention it, Norcott usually kept that particular drawer slightly ajar. Said it helped with air circulation for the specimens inside. I've never seen it completely closed and locked before. Inspector Slack produced his notebook again. Mrs. Norcott, do you have keys to your husband's specimen cabinets? Mrs. Norcott's hand moved instinctively to the small silver chatelaine that hung at her waist, a delicate chain bearing several small keys that caught the lamplight as they moved. Jasper gave me a set of spare keys when we married. For emergencies, he said, though I've rarely had occasion to use them. Might we examine the contents of that locked drawer? Miss Marple's tone was conversational, but there was an underlying firmness that suggested this was more than a casual request. Mrs. Norcott hesitated for a moment, her fingers playing nervously with the keys. Then, with movements that seemed almost mechanical, she selected a small brass key and approached the cabinet. The lock turned smoothly, and the drawer slid open with the well-oiled precision that characterized all of Mr. Norcott's equipment. The contents were not what one might have expected from a specimen drawer. Instead of carefully mounted butterflies, the drawer contained papers, legal documents, correspondence, and what appeared to be a recently drafted will or codicil. Inspector Slack lifted the topmost document carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read. This appears to be a codicil to Mr. Norcott's existing will, dated just 3 days ago. Miss Marple had positioned herself where she could observe Mrs. Norcott's reaction to this discovery. The younger woman's face had gone completely white, and her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the cabinet for support. The provisions are quite specific, Inspector Slack continued, his voice taking on the formal tone of official pronouncement. The entire butterfly collection is to be donated to the Natural History Museum in London. The house and grounds are to be left to a nephew, one William Norcott of Yorkshire. Dr. Kerr whistled softly. That's a significant change from his previous arrangements, I assume. Mrs. Norcott found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Under the original will, everything came to me. The collection, the house, all of it. Jasper said it was only right, as his wife. And this new codicil changes all of that, Miss Marple observed gently, leaving you with what precisely? A modest annual income, Mrs. Norcott replied, her voice bitter now. Enough to live respectably, Jasper said, but hardly what one might call comfortable. Certainly not enough to maintain Benham Grange. Inspector Slack had continued reading through the documents, his frown deepening. There's correspondence here as well, letters from estate agents regarding the potential sale of the property. It appears Mr. Norcott was planning to sell Benham Grange to finance an expedition to South America. The implications of these revelations hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Norcott would have found herself not merely disinherited, but effectively homeless, while her husband pursued his scientific passions on the other side of the world. Paul Retton had grown very quiet during this recital, his earlier nervousness replaced by what appeared to be genuine sympathy for Mrs. Norcott's position. I had no idea Mr. Norcott was considering such drastic changes. He never mentioned anything about revising his will. But someone knew, Miss Marple said softly. Someone knew enough to ensure that this drawer was locked, keeping these documents hidden from casual observation. Mrs. Norcott's composure finally cracked entirely. He never consulted me, never asked what I thought about giving away everything. We'd built together, just decided in his careful, methodical way that his butterflies were more important than his wife's security. Inspector Slack had been examining the lock mechanism with professional interest. This drawer locks automatically, when closed, but it can be opened from the inside if one knows the proper technique. Rather convenient for someone who wanted to conceal documents but still have access to them. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the keys, Mrs. Norcott. How smoothly you produce the correct one, almost as if you'd used it recently." The accusation was implicit but unmistakable. Mrs. Norcott had known about the codicil, had access to it, and had therefore possessed perhaps the strongest motive imaginable for wanting to prevent its implementation. The study fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft rustle of papers as Inspector Slack carefully replaced the documents in their drawer. Outside, night was settling over Benham Grange, and with it came the growing certainty that the afternoon's tragedy had been no accident. It had been murder planned and executed with the same methodical precision that Mr. Norcott brought to his scientific work, but turned against him by someone who knew his habits intimately enough to exploit them. Someone who had everything to lose if those carefully drafted legal documents ever took effect. Chapter 7. The Net with the Wrong Loop. The discovery of the codicil had cast a new and darker shadow over the evening's proceedings, but Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the conservatory once more. There was something about the scene that continued to trouble her, some small detail that refused to settle properly in her methodical mind. "Inspector," she said suddenly, "I wonder if we might return once more to Mr. Norcott's study. There's something about those wing fragments that Mrs. Bid mentioned cleaning up this morning. I have a rather specific suspicion about their origin." Inspector Slack followed her with the weary resignation of a man who had learned to trust her instincts, even when they led him down paths he might not have chosen to explore. The others trailed behind, their earlier curiosity now tempered by the growing weight of evidence that pointed toward deliberate murder. The conservatory had finally begun to cool slightly as the June evening deepened, though the air remained thick and humid. Miss Marple moved slowly among the tropical plants, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail with the precision of a naturalist conducting a survey. "The butterfly net," she said suddenly, pausing near the entrance where a long-handled net rested against the glass wall. "Paul, my dear boy, you mentioned that Mr. Norcott was quite particular about his equipment." Paul Retton approached with the cautious manner of someone who had learned to expect surprises from Miss Marple's observations. "Yes, Miss Marple, Mr. Norcott insisted that every tool be properly maintained and used correctly. He said careless technique could damage specimens beyond repair." Miss Marple lifted the net carefully, examining the construction with the sort of attention she might have given to a piece of fine embroidery. The net itself was made of the finest silk mesh, designed to capture delicate creatures without harm, and the handle was polished wood that spoke of regular use and careful maintenance. "The attachment point," she murmured, indicating where the net was secured to the handle. "How would Mr. Norcott typically tie this?" Paul Retton took the net and demonstrated with practiced ease, his fingers working quickly to secure the mesh, with what appeared to be a specialized knot, a quick slip loop like this. "Mr. Norcott taught me the technique when I first started working for him, said it was essential for rapid deployment when chasing an escaped specimen." Miss Marple watched the demonstration with considerable interest, then asked him to untie the knot and examine how it was currently secured. Paul's expression grew puzzled as he worked at the fastenings. "This is odd," he said slowly. "This isn't tied with a quick slip loop at all. It's a button loop knot, the sort milliners use for hat fastenings. Much more secure, but it takes longer to tie and untie." Dr. Kerr moved closer to observe the knotwork. "Are you certain about that, young man? It seems a rather specialized distinction." "Quite certain, sir. Mr. Norcott drilled proper knot technique into me from the very beginning. He said a lepidopterist's equipment was only as good as his ability to deploy it quickly and correctly." Miss Marple had been listening, to this exchange with the sort of quiet satisfaction that suggested her instincts had once again proved reliable. "And when did you last see Mr. Norcott use this particular net?" Paul. "Earlier this afternoon, Miss Marple. Just before the visitors arrived, he was demonstrating the proper technique for capturing specimens without damage. I distinctly remember watching him tie the quick slip loop." Inspector Slack had produced his notebook again and was making careful notes about the knot discrepancy. "So someone retied this net between this afternoon and now, using a completely different technique." Mrs. Norcott had remained silent during this discussion, but Miss Marple noticed how her hands had unconsciously moved to smooth her hair, a gesture that revealed the sort of automatic tidiness that comes from years of careful grooming. Miss Felicity Wade, who had been quietly observing from near the doorway, suddenly spoke up with obvious embarrassment. "I'm afraid I must apologize. That button loop knot, I'm rather familiar with it myself." All eyes turned to the art mistress, whose face had flushed pink with discomfort. "I spent several years working in a millinery shop in London before I took up teaching. We use that particular knot constantly for securing hat decorations and veils. It becomes quite automatic after a while." Miss Marple's expression remained gently encouraging. "How interesting, Miss Wade. And you would recognize such a knot immediately, I assume." "Oh, yes, certainly. Though I must say it does seem an odd choice for securing a butterfly net, rather like using a surgeon's knot to tie one's shoelaces. Effective, but unnecessarily complicated for the purpose." Mrs. Norcott had grown very still during this conversation. Her earlier agitation was replaced by a watchful tension that reminded Miss Marple of a cat preparing to flee. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of defensive irritation. "I'm sure I don't see what significance a knot can possibly have. Perhaps Jasper simply tied it differently this time, or Paul is mistaken about his usual method." But Paul Reeton shook his head firmly. "I'm quite certain, Mrs. Norcott. Mr. Norcott was very consistent about such things. He always said that proper technique, once learned, should become as natural as breathing." Miss Marple had been examining Mrs. Norcott with a sort of gentle attention that made many people uncomfortable, though her manner remained perfectly polite. "Mrs. Norcott, forgive my curiosity, but didn't you mention earlier that you had worked in London before your marriage? I believe you said something about a hat shop." The silence that followed this question seemed to stretch interminably. Mrs. Norcott's face had gone quite pale, and her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles showed white beneath the skin. I may have mentioned it. I worked briefly for a milliner in Bond Street. Nothing significant, just a temporary position before I married Jasper." Miss Felicity Wade's eyes had widened with sudden understanding. "A milliner's assistant would certainly know button loop knots. We use them dozens of times each day. Once you've learned the technique, it becomes quite automatic. Rather difficult to avoid using it, actually." Inspector Slack was making rapid notes, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Mrs. Norcott, are you telling us that you possess the specific knowledge required to tie the knot we found on this net?" That doesn't mean anyone could have." Mrs. Norcott's voice trailed off as she realized the implications of her admission. Miss Marple had replaced the net against the wall, but her eyes remained fixed on Mrs. Norcott with sympathetic understanding. "My dear, in my experience, we never quite lose the skills of our youth. A milliner's training would include not only knot work, but the sort of precise, careful attention to detail that this entire scheme required." The evidence was mounting with inexorable logic. Mrs. Norcott had possessed the materials needed to fool the heating system, knowledge of her husband's will changes, access to his study and specimens, and now it appeared she had also retired. The butterfly net with a knot that revealed her specific professional background. Each small detail might have been explained away individually, but together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. The careful planning, the intimate knowledge of Mr. Norcott's habits and equipment, the precise timing required. To execute such an elaborate scheme, it all pointed to someone who lived in the house, understood its routines, and possessed both motive and opportunity. Someone who had learned to create beautiful, precisely crafted deceptions in a Bond Street milliner's shop, and had applied those same skills to far deadlier purposes at Benham Grange. Chapter 8. A Butterfly That Died Twice. The atmosphere in the conservatory had grown heavy with more than just the humid air. Mrs. Norcott stood frozen near the entrance, her earlier composure completely shattered, as the weight of accumulating evidence pressed down upon her like a physical force. Miss Marple, however, seemed far from finished with her methodical examination of the scene. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wonder if we might return once more to Mr. Norcott's study. There's something about those wing fragments that Mrs. Biddy mentioned cleaning up this morning. I have a rather specific suspicion about their origin." Inspector Slack nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on Mrs. Norcott, with the intensity of a man who sensed his quarry was nearly cornered. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I trust Mrs. Bid disposed of the debris in the usual manner." Mrs. Bid, who had been hovering uncertainly in the background throughout the evening's revelations, stepped forward with obvious relief at being asked a straightforward question. "Oh, no, Inspector. I never throw away anything from Mr. Norcott's study without his permission. Everything went into the wastebasket beside his desk. Same as always." The small procession made its way back to the study, where the wastebasket in question sat in its accustomed place beside the mahogany desk. Miss Marple approached it with a sort of careful attention she might have given to examining rare porcelain, though the contents appeared to be nothing more than ordinary household refuse. "Might we examine the contents, Inspector? I have the feeling they may tell us a rather interesting story." Inspector Slack carefully emptied the basket onto a sheet of newspaper, revealing the usual detritus of scholarly work. Discarded papers, a broken pen nib, several fragments of what appeared to be mounting pins, and something that made Miss Marple lean forward with sudden interest. "There," she said softly, pointing to a delicate fragment of brilliant blue wing. "Material. Paul, my dear boy, would you mind examining this piece very carefully? I believe you'll find it quite instructive." Paul Reeton picked up the wing fragment with a gentle touch of someone accustomed to handling delicate specimens. His expression grew puzzled as he studied it more closely, turning it to catch the light from different angles. "This is most peculiar," he said slowly. "This appears to be from a morpho butterfly, but there are 2 pinholes in it, here and here." He indicated 2 tiny punctures in the wing membrane, both showing signs of having been made by mounting pins. Dr. Kerr moved closer to examine the fragment, his scientific curiosity overriding the evening's dramatic tensions. 2 pinholes. That would suggest this wing was mounted twice. But why would anyone remount a specimen? Miss Marple had been watching Mrs. Norcott's face during this examination, noting how the younger woman's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Perhaps, Dr. Kerr, because the specimen was deliberately damaged and then hastily repaired to serve a particular purpose. Paul Reeton was continuing his examination of the wing fragment, his expertise revealing additional details. "There's something else odd here. This wing has been treated with clear nail varnish. Just a tiny drop, but enough to strengthen the membrane around the pinholes." "Nail varnish?" Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose. "That seems a rather unscientific preservation method." Indeed, it would be for a legitimate specimen, agreed Miss Marple. But if one needed to quickly repair a damaged wing to make it appear whole, nail varnish might serve as an emergency measure. The implications were becoming increasingly clear. Someone had deliberately damaged a mounted morpho specimen, then attempted a hasty repair to make it appear intact. Combined with the empty glassine triangle labeled Morpho Live, it suggested an elaborate deception designed to create the illusion of an escaped butterfly. Mrs. Norcott had sunk into the chair beside the desk, her face buried in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was muffled but audible. You don't understand. None of you understand what it was like living with a man who cared more about dead insects than his own wife. Inspector Slack approached her carefully, his notebook ready. Mrs. Norcott, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence. But Mrs. Norcott seemed beyond caring about such warnings. He was going to leave me with nothing but a pittance, and the knowledge that his precious butterflies were worth more to him than 20 years of marriage. Miss Marple had settled into another chair, her knitting appearing in her hands with the automatic gesture of a long habit. My dear, would you like to tell us how it happened? Sometimes it helps to speak about these things. Mrs. Norcott looked up, her eyes red with unshed tears. I found the codicil last week. He'd left it on his desk as if it didn't matter whether I saw it or not. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, gone, given away to museums and distant relatives who never cared about him the way I did. Paul Reeton had been examining more fragments from the wastebasket, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Mrs. Norcott, this wing came from the blue morpho in case 7. It was one of Mr. Norcott's prize specimens, irreplaceable. I only meant to borrow it, Mrs. Norcott said desperately. I thought if I could create the illusion of an escape, make him rush into the conservatory when it was sealed and overheated, I only wanted to make him faint, to frighten him enough that he'd listen to reason about the will. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked. But butterfly wings are fragile things, aren't they? Once damaged, they can never quite be the same again. It broke when I tried to remove it from the mounting. The wing just snapped. I tried to repair it with nail varnish and remount it, but I knew Jasper would notice eventually, so I created the fake specimen envelope and hid the damaged wing in the wastebasket. Inspector Slack was taking careful notes, his expression grave but not unsympathetic. And the heating system, Mrs. Norcott, the ice and muslin? I'd watched Jasper explain the temperature controls to visitors dozens of times. I knew that if I could fool the sensor into thinking it was cold, the heater would run continuously. Combined with the sealed vents, she shuddered. I never intended for it to go so far. I just wanted him to collapse, to be found quickly, and realize how fragile life could be. Dr. Kerr shook his head sadly. Heat stroke can be fatal. Mrs. Norcott, you must have known the risks. I thought someone would find him quickly. I was going to discover him myself after a few minutes. But then Miss Marple suggested we all go together, and by the time we reached him, her voice broke completely. The study fell silent, except for the gentle clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles and the soft sound of Mrs. Norcott's weeping. Outside, the June night was settling over Benham Grange, bringing with it the melancholy knowledge that a marriage built on shared dreams had ended in betrayal and attempted murder. The butterfly that had died twice, first in nature, then again, at human hands, seemed to embody everything that had gone wrong in this house, where beauty and passion had been corrupted by greed and desperation. A fitting symbol, Miss Marple thought sadly, for the tragic fragility of human relationships when they are subjected to pressures they were never designed to bear. Chapter 9. The Beeswax Drop on the Bolt. Mrs. Norcott's partial confession had filled in many of the gaps in the evening's puzzle, but Miss Marple found herself still troubled by one crucial detail. The mechanism by which the conservatory door had been secured from the inside remained unexplained, and in her experience, such mechanical mysteries often held the key to understanding the complete picture. "Mrs. Norcott," she said gently, her knitting needles never pausing in their steady rhythm, "you've explained how you created the conditions that made the conservatory so dangerously hot, and how you lured your husband inside with a false specimen. But how did you ensure that he couldn't simply leave when he began to feel unwell?" Mrs. Norcott looked up from her hands, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes now holding a defeated sort of honesty. "The door has a spring bolt mechanism. If you know how to work it, you can make it lock automatically when the door closes." Inspector Slack's pen stopped moving across his notebook. "You'll need to be more specific, Mrs. Norcott. How exactly does one manipulate a spring bolt from the outside?" "It's not complicated," she replied wearily. "The bolt can be drawn back and held in place with a small wedge. When the wedge is removed or dissolves, the bolt springs forward and locks the door." Miss Marple had set down her knitting and was regarding Mrs. Norcott with a sort of focused attention that had solved many mysteries over the years. "And what sort of wedge did you use, my dear?" "Beeswax," Mrs. Norcott whispered. "A small sliver of beeswax and a pin to hold it in place. When the heat in the conservatory melted the wax, the bolt would spring home automatically." Dr. Kerr whistled softly. "Ingenious, in a horrible sort of way. The very heat that was meant to incapacitate Mr. Norcott would also ensure his imprisonment." Miss Marple had risen from her chair and was moving toward the door with purpose. "Inspector, I believe we should examine this spring bolt mechanism immediately. If Mrs. Norcott's account is accurate, there may still be evidence of her method." The group made their way back to the conservatory, where the evening air had finally begun to cool the oppressive atmosphere slightly. Miss Marple approached the door with a methodical care of someone conducting a scientific experiment, examining the bolt mechanism with her magnifying glass. "Here," she said softly, indicating a tiny amber-colored droplet on the inner surface of the bolt housing. "This appears to be beeswax, hardened now, but still visible." Inspector Slack produced his torch and examined the spot Miss Marple had indicated. The tiny bead of wax was indeed present, positioned exactly where it would have held the bolt mechanism in place until heat caused it to soften and release. "Extraordinary attention to detail," he murmured. "This required considerable planning and knowledge of the door's mechanics." Mrs. Bantry, who had remained largely silent throughout the evening's revelations, spoke up with obvious distress. "Lydia, how could you have planned such a thing? The precision required, the careful timing." Mrs. Norcott's composure had returned somewhat, though her voice remained hollow. "I had weeks to observe and plan. Jasper was so absorbed in his specimens that he rarely noticed what I was doing. I tested the wax method several times when he was away to ensure it would work properly." Paul Retton had been examining the bolt mechanism with professional interest. "The spring tension on this bolt is quite strong. It would take considerable force to keep it retracted, even with a wedge." "Which explains the pin," Miss Marple observed. "Mrs. Norcott, you used a pin to secure the wax in place, didn't you? Something that would hold firmly but not interfere with the melting process." Mrs. Norcott nodded miserably. "A hat pin, actually. One of my old ones from my millinery days. I pushed it through the wax and into the small gap in the bolt housing. When the wax melted, the pin would fall away and the bolt would close." Inspector Slack was making detailed notes and sketches of the mechanism, And you were certain the wax would melt quickly enough in the heated conservatory? I tested it, Mrs. Norcott replied. Beeswax has a relatively low melting point. In the sort of heat I knew the conservatory would reach, it would soften within minutes of the door being closed. Miss Marple had been examining the floor around the door, her sharp eyes noting every detail. Mrs. Bantry, dear, might you help me demonstrate something? If you would be so kind as to draw back this bolt and hold it in place while I examine the mechanism. Mrs. Bantry obliged, though with obvious reluctance. Miss Marple studied the positioning carefully, noting how a small wedge could indeed hold the bolt in its retracted position. The beauty of this method, she said thoughtfully, is its apparent impossibility. From the outside, it would appear that the door had locked itself with no human intervention required. Dr. Kerr shook his head in amazement. A self-executing trap. The victim's own movements in closing the door behind him would trigger the mechanism that would ensure his imprisonment. Exactly, agreed Miss Marple. And by the time the heat began to affect Mr. Norcott seriously, the wax would have long since melted, and the evidence would be virtually invisible. Mrs. Norcott was watching this demonstration with the detached air of someone observing the dissection of their own carefully constructed plans. I thought it was perfect, she said quietly. No direct violence, no obvious murder weapon, just an unfortunate accident in an overheated conservatory. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Mrs. Norcott, I must formally caution you that you are under arrest on suspicion of the attempted murder of your husband. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. Mrs. Norcott received this announcement with surprising calm, as if she'd been expecting it for hours. I understand, Inspector, though I want to make it clear once more that I never intended for Jasper to die, only wanted to frighten him, to make him reconsider his plans. Miss Marple had retrieved her knitting and was regarding the younger woman with genuine sympathy. My dear, the road to tragedy is often paved with intentions that seemed reasonable at the time. But when we allow anger and hurt to guide our actions, the results are rarely what we hope to achieve. As they prepared to leave the conservatory for the final time that evening, Miss Marple paused to look back at the tropical paradise that had so nearly become a tomb. The beautiful butterflies continued their eternal dance among the exotic plants, oblivious to the human drama that had played out in their glass-walled world. It struck her as profoundly sad that a place dedicated to preserving life and beauty had been transformed into an instrument of destruction by the very human emotions that should have been its protection. The beeswax drop on the bolt had been the final piece of a puzzle built from jealousy, desperation, and the tragic collision between love and greed. Like the butterflies themselves, it was beautiful in its precision, but deadly in its ultimate purpose. Chapter 10. Evensong, and the hand that melted the door. 3 days later, Miss Marple sat in the comfortable sitting room of the vicarage at St. Mary Mead, taking tea with the Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Griselda. The events at Benham Grange had concluded with Mrs. Norcott's formal charging and remand, while Mr. Norcott himself was recovering steadily at the hospital in Much Benham. The scandal had naturally become the primary topic of conversation throughout the district. Mrs. Bantry had joined them for tea, her usual cheerful demeanor somewhat subdued by the tragic circumstances they had all witnessed. Outside, the June evening was drawing to a peaceful close with the sound of church bells calling the faithful to evensong drifting through the open windows. I still find it difficult to believe, Griselda was saying, pouring tea from the best china service. Lydia always seemed so devoted to her husband, such an elegant woman and always so perfectly turned out. Miss Marple accepted her cup with a gentle smile. My dear Griselda, in my experience, the most perfectly turned out people are often those who have learned to hide their true feelings most effectively. Mrs. Norcott's training in the millinery trade served her well in more ways than one. The Reverend Clement leaned forward in his chair, his scholarly face creased with concern. The question that troubles me, Miss Marple, is how someone could plan such an elaborate scheme with such cold calculation, the attention to detail, the careful timing. It suggests a mind capable of extraordinary deception. Indeed, Leonard, but you see, Mrs. Norcott possessed exactly the sort of skill such a plan required. Her background in hat-making had taught her precision, patience, and the ability to create beautiful facades that concealed complex structures beneath. Mrs. Bantry set down her teacup with a small clink. You mean her professional training actually prepared her for murder? Miss Marple considered this carefully. Not for murder exactly, but for the sort of methodical planning and attention to detail that the scheme required. Consider what we discovered. The fresh brass filings beneath the tightened vents showing someone had sealed the roof ventilation with deliberate care. The damp lint and condensation ring at the thermostat bulb, where ice wrapped in muslin had fooled the heating system into thinking the conservatory was cold rather than dangerously hot. She paused to sip her tea before continuing. Then there was the glassine triangle that weighed nothing. A piece of bait designed to draw Mr. Norcott into the trap. The butterfly net tied with a milliner's button loop rather than a collector's quick slip knot. A morpho wing bearing 2 pinholes and a drop of clear nail varnish, evidence of a broken specimen hastily repaired to support the fiction of an escape. And finally, the tiny bead of beeswax on the door bolt, evidence of the most crucial element of the plan. Mrs. Norcott understood that her husband would never remain in an overheated conservatory voluntarily. She needed to ensure he couldn't leave even when he began to feel unwell. The Reverend Clement nodded slowly, each clue pointing to someone with specific knowledge and skills. Precisely. And finally, the tiny bead of beeswax on the door bolt, evidence of the most crucial element of the plan. Mrs. Norcott understood that her husband would never remain in an overheated conservatory voluntarily. She needed to ensure he couldn't leave, even when he began to feel unwell. Griselda shuddered delicately. How perfectly horrible to think of him trapped in there, growing weaker as the temperature rose. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. What strikes me most about this case is how Mrs. Norcott used the very things her husband loved against him. His passion for preserving specimens, his careful attention to his equipment, his immediate response to any threat to his collection. She turned all of these admirable qualities into weapons. Mrs. Bantry had been listening intently. But what drove her to such extremes, Jane? Surely the money alone. It wasn't simply the money, Dolly, though that was certainly part of it. Mrs. Norcott told us herself. She found the codicil that would have left the collection to museums and the house to a distant nephew. More than that, she discovered letters about Mr. Norcott's plans to sell Benham Grange to finance an expedition to South America. The Reverend Clement's eyebrows rose. She would have been left with nothing but a modest income and the knowledge that 20 years of marriage had counted for less than a collection of preserved insects. Miss Marple replied sadly. When confronted with our evidence, the iced censer bulb, the wax residue, the milliner's knot, she finally admitted the truth. She claimed she had only meant to make him faint, to force him to listen to reason about the will. Griselda refilled the teacups, her movements automatic as she absorbed this information. Do you believe her, Miss Marple? That she didn't intend to kill him? Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her needles clicking steadily as she worked on a new piece of knitting. "I believe she told herself that, my dear, but anyone who seals a man in an overheated conservatory on a warm June day must understand the possible consequences. Heat stroke can be fatal, particularly for someone of Mr. Norcott's age." Through the window they could see a blue butterfly, quite possibly one that had escaped from the damaged conservatory, drift past in the evening light. Mrs. Bantry watched it with a wistful expression. "So delicate," she murmured, "and so cruel in its way." Miss Marple followed her gaze. "Beauty can indeed be a case label, Dolly. Very neat and very misleading. But it's the little household means that tell the truth in the end. A knot tied by hands that once dressed fashionable hats, a bead of wax that melted under artificial heat, a scrap of muslin borrowed from the kitchen stores." The Reverend Clement leaned back in his chair, and these small domestic details revealed the larger pattern. "They always do, Leonard. Grand passions and dramatic gestures capture our attention, but it's the everyday skills and ordinary materials that people actually use when they commit crimes. Mrs. Norcott didn't employ exotic poisons or dramatic weapons. She used ice, muslin, beeswax, and the precise domestic skills she had learned in her youth." As the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste of it all. Mr. Norcott would recover, but his marriage was destroyed and his beloved collection damaged. Mrs. Norcott faced imprisonment, her reputation in ruins, and her future uncertain. All because love had curdled into resentment, and resentment had hardened into a determination to prevent what seemed like betrayal. "The saddest part," she said finally, "is that it was all so unnecessary. If Mrs. Norcott had simply spoken to her husband about her fears, if she had trusted him enough to share her concerns about the will—" "You think he might have reconsidered?" asked Griselda. "I think 20 years of marriage deserved at least the chance for honest conversation before it ended in attempted murder," Miss Marple replied gently. "But pride and hurt feelings can make people do terrible things, particularly when they feel cornered and desperate." The church bells had stopped ringing and evensong was beginning in the village church. Somewhere in the peaceful evening, people were gathering to reflect on forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of new beginnings. But at Benham Grange, the butterfly house stood empty and cooling, its tropical paradise transformed into a monument to the tragic fragility of human relationships when they are subjected to pressures they were never designed to bear. Miss Marple folded her knitting and prepared to take her leave. The case was closed. Justice would take its course, and life in St. Mary Mead would return to its customary peaceful rhythm. But she would not soon forget the lesson of the butterfly collector's murder, that even the most carefully constructed facades can be undone by the smallest details, and that the hand capable of creating beauty is equally capable of destroying it when love turns to desperation. "Fine,"